The other thing, as we prepare for, or as we're in the month talking about vocations, your kids are going to be coming out of class with a prayer card. And so each child will have a prayer card that lists one of the seminarians right now at the diocese. And so there's a prayer on there, and we ask that families just keep those seminarians in their prayers over this month as you're learning about vocations. And so with that, I'm really excited to, you've probably all met Brad and Lindsey, and I was telling them tonight how brave they are. I could stand up and give instructions all day, but any feelings would be too much for me up here, so kudos to everyone who has presented this year. But Brad and Lindsey are both from the St. Matthew's Parish in Vernon, where they've served in various ministries over the years. They've been married almost 9 years and have 3 little rapscallions. Did I even say that right? Nora, August, and Grant. They keep busy with their careers and hobby farm, but their most important job is establishing a strong Catholic family culture. In her happy place, Lindsey's rarely found without either a cup of coffee, a book, or a pair of yard work gloves, and Brad would spend every moment of his day in the garden if he could. Brad also keeps busy digging into new yard projects, and Lindsey keeps busy reminding him to finish all the projects he started, which sounds really familiar to me. So, welcome. We're excited to hear about the Ten Commandments.
So to kick us off, this is our crew. The child that looks like there's a bear on the other side of the camera, that's August. Mr. Cleanup here is Grant, and then this sweetheart is Nora. So when we were asked to do, when Brad was asked to do this talk, he came home with the idea, and he said, do you want to do it? And I said, well, depends, what's the topic? A couple days later, he comes back and he's like, I have news. It's the Ten Commandments. And I'm like, oh, geez, what? And I was like, absolutely not. Was my initial response to doing this talk. And Brad just kind of was like, okay, and he let it lie there. And God is funny, because all of a sudden, I'm sitting in Mass and like ideas are just pouring in during the homily that I'm supposed to be listening to, and I find myself opening the computer a couple weeks later and just starting to put pen to paper, and Brad's like, you're hooked now, you can't get out of this. But I really started to explore why I said no to this talk. And what I found was it really triggered into the biases that I had with the Ten Commandments. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm stuck in a Moses activity sheet. For me, the Ten Commandments is something I learned in like 1st, 2nd grade, and I was like, how on earth am I going to elevate this topic to you all, to a bunch of adults? So I found I was stuck in this bias. Maybe some of you think of the Ten Commandments as kind of a contractual obligation that we have with God, a set of rules that we need to follow. I was also kind of stuck here, right? Where it's like, it's foreign, it's a little dusty, I was worried you all were going to fall asleep in the pew. And maybe the classic 1956 Charles Heston film speaks to you. Maybe that's how you were exposed to the Ten Commandments first. So maybe just to kind of kick us off, we thought it would be appropriate to kind of acknowledge, like, how are we approaching this topic, and where do we sit here?
Yeah, so I mean, we could spend the entire time just talking, here's the Ten Commandments, here's what they mean, here's what we should do, shouldn't do, but instead we're going to take a little bit deeper look. So first up is unpacking the divine revelation of the Ten Commandments. Lindsey's put together just a neat little art block to kind of go through the story leading up to the Ten Commandments. Why do we have them? And let's do that through some art. And then from there, we're going to get into the whole story's linchpin. The thing that holds it together that a lot of times we often forget about when we look at the Ten Commandments. From there, we're going to get into some Divine Law 101. We'll try not to bore you too much. And then lastly, we'll unpack the Ten Commandments and how God is using those 10 commandments to reclaim his people, to bring them in a closer union with him. So to get us started, there's this beautiful quote here from Jeff Cavins. He's a genius biblical scholar, and he says that God reveals himself to man gradually. And this is a really deep meaning, because God is so beautiful and so complex that our finite human minds cannot fully comprehend God, the mystery of God. So over time, God has slowly been revealing more and more of himself to us. How do we live in perfect union with him? And we'll kind of go through that gradual process a little bit to see where we were at the 10 Commandments and how Christ kind of changed things and evolved things into where we are today.
So to tee off of what Brad just talked about, I stole this from Dr. Scott Hahn. So God started his divine revelation through one holy couple. In case you can't see the fine print, if you picked up a handout, this is on your handout. He then revealed himself to one holy family through Noah and his sons. Next, he revealed himself to one holy tribe through Abraham and our friend Moses, amongst the other patriarchs. Next, to one holy kingdom through King David. And then lastly, through one worldwide holy church through Christ and us, the church. And you'll notice as we go down this pyramid, not only does God's covenant get deeper, it also gets wider in who it reaches. And so in the context of divine revelation, here's where we're going to go deeper. So the 10 Commandments were a direct revelation of God himself to Moses. And God's law is part and parcel of divine revelation. It really played that one of those major pivot points in the history of Israel as God's chosen people. All right, so next we're going to go through like a little kind of Cliff Notes art walk of the story leading up to the 10 Commandments. We tried to pick as much as we could art, especially by Jewish artists, if we could. So to kick off the story, really it starts with the bondage of the Israelites within Egypt, right? They're treated very harshly and forced to do harsh labor.
And then Pharaoh commanded all of his people that every boy that is born to the Hebrews, you shall throw him into the Nile. When Moses was born, his mother put him in a basket and placed him in the river. The daughter of Pharaoh found Moses and took him in as her own son.
So then Moses grows up right in the Israelite culture and grows up to be a man. And one day he witnesses his own people being beaten by an Egyptian. He kills this Egyptian and then flees outside of the country. Later he gets married and he has a son.
And then God remembered his covenant with the Israelites, and God appeared to Moses through the burning bush. And God there charged Moses to free the Israelites from Pharaoh.
All right, and then when Moses returns to Egypt, he repeatedly requests that Pharaoh let God's people go. And this piece of art is a much more abstract piece. It's called Staffs and Snakes, and really it depicts that pivotal turning point in this story where Pharaoh's magicians, they convert their staffs into snakes, and then Aaron, Moses' brother, converts his staff into a snake, and Aaron's snake eats the snakes of the other snakes, of the magicians. And this is actually really important. It has deep symbolic meaning because it's God's way of setting himself higher than the Egyptians and higher than the Egyptian gods. And it's kind of the first step that God takes in really manifesting his power and reclaiming his people. And these same sorts of themes play out in the 10 plagues that follow.
There's the subsequent plagues, and then on the eve of the 10th and final plague, Moses ordered the Israelites to be prepared to flee, to slaughter a lamb and eat the first Passover meal, and splash the blood of the lamb on the doorposts and lintels so the angel of death would pass over them. And these are obviously stories you guys are all familiar with. This 10th plague was the death of the firstborn, which resulted in the death of Pharaoh's own son.
Because of that death, Pharaoh orders the Israelites out of Egypt. And then to escape, God instructs Moses to stretch his arms over the Red Sea, and the Egyptians are able to, the Israelites are able to pass through on that dry land. The Egyptians pursue, and God closes up the Red Sea on the Egyptians.
And then the Lord went in front of the Israelites in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, so they could travel day and night.
So we're going to take a brief break from that lovely little art walk because I thought it was cool to show the route that they took. So they started in Ramesses up in Egypt. They traveled south to Mount Sinai. Fun fact, Mount Sinai is also the place of the burning bush. This is where the 10 Commandments were received. And then that is their pit stop before they head north again into the Promised Land.
And then our last art piece here telling the story is this Rembrandt painting. Moses went up Mount Horeb. He spoke with God for 40 days and 40 nights. Then God gave Moses the 2 stone tablets of the covenant written in the finger of God. From there, that kind of shows the story of getting to and leading up to the 10 Commandments. And as we get into the 10 Commandments, we want to draw attention to one pivotal piece that's oftentimes overlooked.
It's missing from the Hollywood movies, all the things.
We call this the linchpin. You look at the structure of the wheel. To make that work, you have the wheel, you have that axle, but all this doesn't work without that little linchpin at the end to hold it all together. The piece that holds it all together. What do we need to make this work? So to set the stage for getting into what is this linchpin that needs to precede the 10 Commandments that we often forget about, Lindsey's going to walk us through a quick personal reflection, just painting a modern-day picture of God's position in the story. So everyone can just close your eyes as Lindsey kind of walks us through this here.
All right, so imagine a beloved child, spouse, grandchild, or sibling was suddenly abducted from you through human trafficking. While you are parted from them, they are still yours, still your beloved. They are still deep in the depths of your heart, and you would do anything to welcome them home. Unexpectedly, they are miraculously returned to you after 15 or so years of captivity. They are here. However, they are greatly changed and sometimes behave in a manner inconsistent with your beliefs and the family culture in which they were originally raised, simply because of the hostile environment that has been forced upon them for many years. What is your response? You can open your eyes. So when I personally go through this reflection, I envision my daughter Nora. And I envision, just welcoming her home and hugging her and reminding her how beloved she is, and just being there with her in that space, right? The corrections and the rules will come, but first and foremost, she needs to be reminded that she's ours and that she's loved. And so God, in his wisdom, does the same thing with the Israelites. So if you grab the handout, I'm not going to read all of these quotes, but they are on the handout. The very first thing that God does when he brings them, the Israelites, to Mount Sinai, is he consecrates them and he establishes a covenant with them. So I've highlighted in these quotes, some of the ways in which God tries to use, that reclaiming language, right? Like, brought you to myself. If you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my own. So that is the very first thing God does before he gives the 10 Commandments.
Yeah, so God, the Israelites were captive by the Egyptians, and In a sense, like that personal reflection that Lindsey shared of being subject to human trafficking and taken away, that's a lot of what happened to God's people, the Israelites. So God needed to take some time and establish that relationship first with them. Before we can set the rules, that relationship needed to be established. So we have a picture of Lindsey and I up here. This is actually from our third date when we first started dating. And if you think to dating and everything like that, you don't come out gunning with the rules right away. Because if we would have sat down and our third date, Lindsey said, "All right, Brad, here's the rules for dating me. You will do this, this, and this." I would have ran.
They weren't far behind.
She had to slowly reveal the rules and clauses. So that's a lot of what God did too. Is He needed to establish His relationship with the people, with the Israelites, let them know that they're loved, and then bring them to a deeper love with the rules. And these rules redirect back to the relationship. They offer us freedom. We don't need to sit there and think, well, what does God want? What doesn't God want? He is showing us how to love through the Ten Commandments, how He wants to grow in closer union with Him. And those rules direct back to the relationship from there. But the relationship always needs to come first, and that's exactly what God did in His infinite wisdom. So from there, we're now going to get into the Divine Law 101, giving just kind of a 50,000-foot overview of God's law, and then dive a little bit deeper. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Lanoue here.
This is your slide.
Oh. I will be Professor Lanoue here. So the moral law and the truth. God is the author of all laws. Physical, moral, and indirectly human laws, as long as the human law conforms to the law of God. And that comes from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 396 on that. But we're going to focus a little bit here on the moral law. So moral law is designed for our good, and that comes directly to us from the Trinity.
So there's two types of moral law. There's natural law, and this is what we can know about morality simply through how we are created. We can look at ourselves and know something about how we are supposed to behave. And then we also have revealed moral law, and this is a direct teaching for how we are, a direct teaching from God as to how we are to live in right relationship with Him. All right, this is my favorite part. So, I have dubbed this the onion analogy, and we split it into two parts. So you've got the Old Testament on the top and the New Testament on the bottom. So I want you to imagine a tiny little onion shoot just growing up just a little bit out of the ground. So think about that as that's natural law, right? And then just a little bit more of that shoot grows out of the ground, and it deepens again that revelation of God. So that's the moral law revealed from God via the patriarchs and the prophets. And notice that the Ten Commandments actually overlaps the two, right? So you think about, for instance, the commandment, do not kill, right? I can know simply from looking at someone that I'm causing them pain. I know naturally that killing someone is not a good thing. So then, Christ comes into the picture, and imagine Christ reaching down into the ground and just uprooting the onion, roots and all. So Christ is the expansion and fulfillment of the law. He doesn't replace the law, he just deepens it, right? So imagine, right, that onion, right? Christ is also the fruit of the onion, and there's tons and tons of layers that you can peel back, right? Because Christ gives us the great commandments to love God and love your neighbor, right? And that calls us to something even higher than the Ten Commandments.
And that goes back really well to that first quote that we had from Jeff Cavins where it said, God reveals Himself to man gradually. God, just like us, if you plant a garden or anything, you put the seed in, and it's a slow process for it to grow. It doesn't just plant the seed, and the next day you have the onion. That's exactly what God did, is He planted that seed, and just a little bit of that came up to reveal Himself to us. And then eventually we were able to see the entire thing through Christ coming in.
Mm-hmm. All right. Then we're going to go a little bit deeper into Christ specifically. So as Christ relates to the law, he was a rule breaker, right? He was accused of breaking the Ten Commandments, specifically the Sabbath comes to mind. And Christ also removed kind of those ritualistic add-ons that the Jewish people had attached to the Ten Commandments, right? 600 rules to follow, no thanks. Christ was also a groundbreaker. He really, like I alluded to before, he really expanded the meaning, be perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect. And along with that heavier responsibility comes greater grace to live in that life. Another thing about the Ten Commandments is only Christ can forgive sins. Ten Commandments don't offer us the chance of salvation per se. Only Christ can do that.
All right, so now's the fun part where we get to start digging in a little bit more to the Ten Commandments. Now, when I traditionally think of the Ten Commandments, my experience with them on a normal basis at this point in my life is generally when I come to church maybe twice a year for reconciliation. You come in, you get the examination of conscience, and you kind of go through. It's a checklist of did I do this, did I do this, and it's kind of that list of rules that we look at. And too often I think we get stuck into looking at the Ten Commandments as a list of rules. But instead it's God's playbook with how to love him. And that's what he gave the Ten Commandments for. It wasn't to say you need to do this, you need to do this. God gave us the Ten Commandments to say, this is how you love me. And that's how we're going to look at the Ten Commandments today, not going into the rules necessarily of them, but digging into what are we called to do through this commandment, and ultimately how is God using this commandment to bring us into a closer union with him and reclaim his people as his own as we may drift away. So we'll get into the first commandment here, which is, I the Lord am your God, you shall have no other gods before me. This one's pretty simple in our context, I feel, but if we look back to the Israelites at this time, they have been in captivity by the Egyptians. And you kind of looked into a little bit of the Egyptian culture. They had numerous gods, many gods. So this is kind of a new concept to a lot of the Israelites at the time. Up here we have a picture of one of their gods, the Egyptians. I think that's Ra. He's like the god of the sun, but the Egyptians would have a god of sun, of fire, of wind, numerous gods. And I'm just thinking, like, we don't worship numerous gods today, but then you look in our culture and it's like, okay, the praise and worship that we give to pop stars, to athletes, to someone who's catching a ball, and worship them like a god, politicians, all that. We're doing a lot of the same stuff today. It's like we kind of need a little fresh reminder on this. So God is calling us to worship just God and God alone, and believe what he has revealed, that onion analogy. Believe what he has shown of himself to us. And also this commandment is calling us to treat holy items with reverence. So how does this reclaim us? How does this bring us closer to God? And Paul wrote about this in his letter to the Corinthians as he talked about faith, hope, and love, which are the three theological virtues. The first one being faith. That's the virtue by which God and all that he is has been revealed to us. We believe everything that God's revealed to us. We have that faith. We know that this is right, that this is good. The next being hope, the virtue which we trust God to fulfill his promises and look forward to eternal life. Hope that, when things go bad, we look with promise towards the future. We don't fall into despair. If we lose a job, if we have a loved one that dies, that we don't question and say, why God, why? We just say, God, I know you're going to make this better. That's what this commandment is asking us to do, to put that hope in God. And the last of the theological virtues being love or charity. That's the virtue by which we love God above all things. And our neighbor, we love them as ourselves. And I pulled up this picture here to kind of show that faith, hope, and love. And as I was looking at it, I saw some symbolism that I've seen before with how that intersects there in the middle. And that's the Holy Trinity. That's God wrapped up in the Holy Trinity through those theological virtues, through faith, hope, and love. And that's what God is calling us to do. By growing in our understanding and love in these virtues, we can grow in our understanding and love for God himself.
All right, so the second commandment is you shall not take the Lord your God in vain. So really this is calling us to speak reverently in our use of God's name and to be truthful in how we take oaths and vows. So in the context of the Hebrew people, they would just very, very carelessly say, I promise to do this, I swear to God I'll do blah, 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 blah. When, you know, they'd make these promises half-heartedly, and arguably we still do that today, right? Fun fact, this is the only commandment in its original form that comes with a curse attached. It says, for Yahweh will not leave unpunished the man who uttered his name to misuse it. So can you flip forward? So how does this reclaim us? It really calls us to use God's name respectfully, and I think even more importantly, respect the mystery of who God is. Kind of harkening back to that onion.
The third commandment, remember to keep holy the Lord's Day. Simply how are we called to attend Sunday Mass, holy days of obligation, and avoid unnecessary physical work. Now, I've always looked at this commandment as, okay, simple, go to church on Sunday and just sit around and be lazy the whole day. I think I use this as an excuse for many years to
Crappy excuse.
say, hey, I'm relaxing on Sunday. I'm going to sit around and watch football. It's what God wants me to do, is to relax. That's what I'm supposed to do. No, God didn't give me an extra day just so I could watch football. God gave us this day so that way we can spend time doing the things that he calls us to do. We do need to work. We need to support our family. That needs to take a high priority in our life throughout the week, but he wants to make sure that we have time in our lives for the things that are important. So it gives us time to spend with our faith, to come to church. Sunday nights we bring our kids to catechesis of the Good Shepherd. We have time to do that through Sunday, through not having work on that day. To have it as a family day, to invest in our culture. Us personally, we probably work physically harder on a lot of Sundays than we probably do any other day of the week. Even though it says up here, avoid unnecessary physical work. But for us, our jobs, we're sitting in front of a computer in the office all day, going out and working hard. That's what our body needs on a Sunday, is to go out and do that. We're always working, and this gives us time to invest in our family, in our home, in our faith, and those are okay things to do. You can cut grass, paint your house. That's not avoiding the unnecessary physical work. Those are things to enrich our family lives and everything there. And it also allows us a chance to do good works of humble service. This is the day of the week that's the most popular at the nursing homes, that the most people come and visit. Because God gave us this day, he wants us to spend that day loving all of his people and building up his community here on earth. The next commandment is honor your father and mother. This one is a very important one. It pertains to everyone in the existence of humanity except for Adam and Eve. Everyone that's ever walked the face of the earth has had a mom and a dad. Even if you're 70, 80, 90 years old, you still have a mom and dad, and you can still respect them through visiting the gravesite or anything like that, taking care of them in old age, and then asking our kids to honor the father and mother as well. So respect and love for our parents. Also respect and obey lawful authority with this commandment, and follow the laws of the state, country, and church, as long as they align with the laws of the church on that. So how does this reclaim God's people? It asks the children to show honor and affection to parents. But what was most fun with kind of putting this presentation together, it was actually a lot of fun. I think we deepened in our understanding a lot just by kind of researching some of this stuff. And as I was digging through the catechesis, and looking at honor your father and mother, I was ready to go to my kids and be like, all right, kids, here's what the church says, here's all of your rules that you guys need to follow to honor your father and mother. But what I was surprised to find was that the section on for kids, the kind of the guidelines that kids need to follow for their parents was like that long. The section for the parents on how to do a good job guiding your kids was much longer. So the rules for me were actually longer than they were for the kids in this sense. So this only works if us as parents are guided in God's love. If we're guiding our children in the wrong direction, away from God, we don't have any right to look back and say, kids, you need to honor and respect me. We can only ask that if we're guiding them to God's love. So it allows us to guide them closer to Christ.
All right. So the fifth commandment is you shall not kill. So how we're called here is really all about how we love our neighbor. Under this also is, how we treat ourselves, right? We shouldn't be harming ourselves. And it also calls us to respect the lives of the unborn as well. Self-defense under this category is legitimate. Capital punishment is kind of supposed to be avoided. And I think I did put a picture up here. Excessive anger, right? Like anger itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. You can be righteously angry, but I think a common one as well is when anger goes too far. So how does this reclaim? It's to foster love between all of God's children, and that realization that God is the Lord of life from beginning to end.
All right, we're going to knock two out in one slide here. With the sixth and ninth commandment, you shall not commit adultery, and you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Put these two together because what the sixth one commands in action, the ninth commandment forbids in thoughts or desires. So how are we called with this? Simply to be pure and modest in our behavior, pure and modest in our thoughts and desires. So having modesty, what exactly does that mean? That means simply to protect the intimate center of who we are as a person. Who we are inside as a person. I'm going to protect that and not allow influences to throw that off. And to avoid dangers, I put that on here as well. Human nature is very, very weak where purity is concerned. This is one of the weakest parts of our human nature. So we need to protect that at all costs, and the easiest way to do that is to avoid temptations. Anyone that might fall subject to these commandments, breaking them, I can guarantee you no one's ever started off with bad intentions. But it's through being temptations not driving them away. Those temptations slowly chip away and just chip at that willpower. So avoiding those temptations to protect that purity within our human nature is very, very important with this commandment. And as far as reclaiming, I came across this quote, which was a good caution that was given to us that I thought was very powerful indeed. So this quote came from Our Lady of Fatima to the Blessed Jacinta in Fatima in 1917. She said, "More souls go to hell because of sins of the flesh than for any other reason." If that doesn't get your attention, I don't know what will. And this was 1917, so over 100 years ago that this was said. And as a society, I don't know if we've necessarily gotten better to keep ourselves away from these temptations. So I think it's a really powerful message to hear and let sink in, and to just ask ourselves within our lives, how are we allowing temptations to chip away at our purity within our human nature? The next two commandments we're putting together as well. Once again, what the seventh commandment, you shall not steal, is asking us to do in action. The 10th commandment forbids in thoughts or desires. So, how are we called ultimately to respect what belongs to others, don't desire what belongs to others? And one of my favorite ones within this one is to care for the land This is, at first I'm like, well, why does this fit under do not steal? Like, I would think maybe this would go to a different place. The plants, the animals, our world, God gave them to us to be the steward of. The plants and animals, this world that we live in is God's world. We're just the caretakers. Lindsey and I, we live on our hobby farm. We've only been there for 12 years. That place has been there for 100 years before us. I hope it's going to be there for 100 years after. We're temporary stewards of that land. If we destroy it, that's stealing God's creation. So taking good care of our plants and animals is part of this. And then how does this reclaim our people, our God's people? Ultimately, it's calling us to detach from earthly possessions. The more things that we desire, that we want, things are just more things that are put in front of our face. Phones are probably the biggest culprit of this thing will keep us away from God more than anything. The more stuff that we want is going to be more things put in front of our face. So God is calling us simply to detach from these earthly possessions, and that will create a capacity to love God in our lives if we can make time for Him.
All right, I'm going to pick up the pace to get us out a little early. So this commandment is, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. So really, in short, we're called to speak the truth in all things and really protect that good name and honor of others in a very truthful and honest way. And this reclaims us because God is called, can you click ahead? God is called the source of all truth, and conversely, Satan is called the father of all lies.
So that kind of wraps up just a quick overview of the commandments, how God is using those commandments to draw us closer. And just a short slide on the implications of the commandments, kind of breaking these commandments, what it means. So we're going to do just a quick breakdown of the types of sins that we have. So the first being original sin, which all of us have through birth, through the sins of Adam and Eve. This is washed away through baptism, and we are perfectly clean and in full union with God at that point. So a good way that I like to look at original sin, that kind of green splotch up there, I look at that as that's God's grace. Through baptism, we are fully surrounded by God's grace to protect us and fully envelop us. Through venial sin, these are sins that maybe aren't super severe, but are still sins against God. These are sins that disobey a moral law, and ultimately they push God away. Maybe a good example of this is you're up late at night, I need to get some bed, I need to get upstairs and say my prayers, but one more episode of Netflix isn't going to hurt me. I'm going to watch that. And you made a decision of maybe I'm going to skip my prayers tonight to do this instead. That's not going to kick God out of your life, but it does push Him away. The more of these sins that we have, the more we push God away. So we have God's grace. We're still fully enveloped within God's grace, but we're kind of pushing ourselves out to the edge through that. And then the last type of sin is mortal sin, the most severe type of sin. For a sin to be mortal, it needs to have three ingredients. It needs to be grave matter, and grave matter ultimately something that destroys the charity or love of the heart. We need to commit that act within full knowledge and deliberate consent. So this would be doing something like, where you say like, God, I know this is a sin. I know this is wrong. And I know this is going to upset you. But you know what, man, I'm going to do it anyway. That's a mortal sin. With these mortal sins, we are deliberately turning ourselves away from God. And you can risk eternal damnation if you don't repent of mortal sin, make it to reconciliation. So ultimately with that, we have God's grace. And now we're standing outside of that. We don't have God's grace to envelop and protect us at all times. We are not in full union with God because we turned our back and walked away from Him. So that's just kind of a quick overview of the sins. There's a lot to unpack within the 10 Commandments. So just to kind of recap what we went through here today, Lindsey had the pyramid at God's covenant. As He's deepening that covenant, growing it wider, we're getting to see more and more of His love. We outlined the story of the 10 Commandments through the art walk. Went into the linchpin that's often forgotten of these commandments only work if we have the relationship, and God made sure He had the relationship with the Israelites before bringing the commandments in. We went into Divine Law 101 with natural law and moral law, and that moral law is for our good and ultimately comes from the Trinity. And then we broke down the 10 Commandments and how those call us closer in union with God and reclaim us. One quick thing that I thought was really neat, Lindsey and I had the opportunity to present this presentation to the catechesis that are teaching right now. And Andrea had a really good point that hit with me, that she picked up from this that I actually didn't pick up. We look at the 10 Commandments a lot of times as the great commandments, the two, love God and love others. The first three are love your God, the last seven are love others, but she made the realization that through how God is calling us on the loving others, it's also drawing us closer to God. It's not just drawing us closer to love others, but by through loving God's children and being in union as a whole, as a church, we can together move closer to God. So all the commandments are to grow closer in love for God. 7 of them just kind of direct our attention a little bit more to our relationships here on earth. So that's kind of it. Thank you for bearing with us here tonight. Anyone has any questions? If not, I'm sure there's some good snacks outside. So, thank you guys.
Thank you.